So I suppose, having been a democracy practitioner and now teaching it, I'm kind of a professional optimist. And Kyrgyzstan, to a lot of ways, makes that a very easy proposition to be. 25 years is not a very long time in the life of a democracy. 25 years after the U.S. colonies declared independence. Yes, I'm going back to history. We had a contingent election which elected Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr because there was a Tom. He was elected by the House of Representatives. We don't do that. No. There was a law which fundamentally changed the entire court system of the United States 25 years after independence. 25 years after the French Revolution and independence, a coalition of forces defeated Napoleon and reestablished the Bourbon monarchy. 25 years is not a long time in the life of a democracy. I remember back to the very early days of democracy seminars in Kyrgyzstan back in 1992. They invariably would begin with the question, what is democracy? And the funny thing is, we basically ask the same question today. Various political parties, activists, journalists, human rights activists, all like to discuss what is democracy in the Kyrgyz context. Why Kyrgyzstan? Why? I think it's, for many reasons, it's a unique place, as we've heard in the first panel, many people in this room know. There's also, I think it's the result of a lot of hard work and a really broad commitment to democratic values. When it became independent 25 years ago, the country charted a very different course from its neighbors. In fact, the country's first president was elected essentially by a quirk in the election law, where the two leading centrally supported candidates didn't get the required majority to win and canceled each other out by law. And in a runoff election, a compromise candidate, Oscar Akayev, was elected. He was not the standard Communist Party politician. In his early years, actually, his policies really promoted the growth of political parties, NGOs, a free press, and many other democratic institutions. This was no small undertaking for a post-Soviet country that had no experience or history with democratic governance or political culture. Over the years, we've witnessed the Kyrgyz Republic struggle domestically and internationally with what sometimes is a clash of cultures as it works to develop Kyrgyz democracy. One such example I want to draw your attention to took place back in 1995 when a number of observers criticized the Kyrgyz government for closing two newspapers. To Western observers and democracy experts, closing a newspaper is a very ominous thing. Closing two newspapers is a grave signal indeed. I was traveling to Kyrgyzstan at the time and met with the two newspaper editors. One refused to register his newspaper, though 100 plus other newspapers had already registered to comply with the new law. But he insisted that this was unconstitutional, and he absolutely categorically would not register his newspaper. The other editor had been publishing what I could even see were articles which were inflammatory for inter-ethnic issues. I spoke with the Minister of Justice, and he told me that he had called the editors personally and begged the one to register, promising that there was nothing untoward about it. It was just simply a bureaucratic step to register. I begged him, he said. The other editor he called up and told that we should stop publishing hateful stories, that in essence, this was the only provision in their constitution against hate speech that said you cannot publish things which would incite inter-ethnic discord. They both refused the minister. And this is the interesting part of the story. The minister's legal recourse was extremely limited. If the editors were in compliance with the law, they would continue to operate. If they were not in compliance, the head would be closed. To Western observers, this seemed intolerant and sober. But actually, he had no other mechanism. There was no history of fees or fines or alternative dispute resolution at this point. There was just simply compliance or not. I spoke to the minister and asked him, I said, closing a newspaper sends a very bad signal. He shrugged his shoulders. I spoke to the editor saying, do you have responsibilities under a democratic system to actually comply democratically? They shrugged their shoulders. There are no blacks or whites in that story, and in many others in Kyrgyzstan. Despite this bump and others along the road, freedom of press and freedom of speech in Kyrgyzstan have played a critical role in the country's democratic development. Think back to the country's first revolution, brought about by perceived corruption, when the press published photos of President Akayev's dacha, bigger, more lavish, far too much for the Kyrgyz people to accept. Shortly thereafter, the government held what were widely regarded as flawed elections. And again, the press published these stories. Combined with the corruption stories, civil society took to the streets and demonstrators marched across the country. By the way, that revolution took place on a Thursday, March 24th, 2005. Several thousand protesters overran the guards at the White House and broke in. What people forget about that day is that it was part of a several-week-long protest to overturn the elections. It was a coalition of opposition parties, NGOs, human rights activists, citizens from all over the country. The leaders of the parties and the NGOs were generally seeking to rerun the recent elections, not overthrow the government. That Thursday, most of the leaders were actually in their offices preparing speeches and preparing for demonstrations coming on the following weekend. They were giving interviews. As one of the leaders said to me, it was a Thursday. No one was expecting anything to happen on a Thursday.
We don't do revolution.
When news got out that the demonstrators had broken into the White House, quickly phones were ringing and people scurried to get back to the demonstration and to be part of the moment. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, these have all been critical opportunities for Kyrgyzstan to develop and evolve its democratic practice. Since independence, Kyrgyz society has been rich with opinions and those willing to express them. Perhaps as a result of this loquaciousness, unlike in many young democracies, political parties in Kyrgyzstan have become real entities. The country's second revolution, it was brought about by mass perception of corruption again, by civil society, and by a very vocal opposition, leaders of political parties. It was a remarkable expression of political will against an overly strong executive bent on staying in power. Over the past 25 years, in both Kyrgyz politics and government, we've seen the rise of real political parties with policies and platforms. And in recent years, we've begun to see the rise of local parties and regional ones, candidates and issues rising up from the local governance level. Unlike most post-Soviet political environments, local politics in the Kyrgyz Republic are now beginning to feed up into national parties and politics as local candidates and their parties become absorbed into the mainstream central party structures in sort of a recharging of the central system. Voice is important in the Kyrgyz democracy, and it's evident. Today's Kyrgyz opposition will most likely tell you that politics in the country is far from perfect, as most opposition parties in most countries will tell you. But politics in Kyrgyzstan undeniably does involve multiple parties and multiple points of view. In fact, we've seen the ruling coalition dissolve in parliament multiple times since the last parliamentary elections. The government has not collapsed. Riots have not broken out. But parties and their leaders have formed new coalitions. Now, some observers will complain that these are backroom deals and obscure political machinations, but that's sort of the grit of parliamentary coalition politics. Quiet discussions on whether parties can work together and how they can work together. In this regard, Kyrgyzstan is a bright spot in the post-Soviet landscape, where political parties evolve and play a larger role. One final thought on this. You have to recognize the Kyrgyz Constitution of 2010, which created a parliamentary system of governance, but also helped to ensure that the country's political party system was integrated into government and politics. Authored by Kyrgyz experts, this constitution, among other things, gave voice to the country's opposition. Not locked out of the building through zero-sum electoral calculus or relegated to throwing rocks from political obscurity. Opposition parties are part of the governing process in Kyrgyzstan. Deputy speakers of the parliament are chosen from the opposition. Heads of key committees in parliament are chosen from opposition parties. Opposition parties are represented in large numbers on the Central Election Commission, on the Committee to Select Judges, and so forth. Across 25 years, the country has experienced 2 revolutions and reinvented governance. Most importantly, civil society continues to play a truly unique role in post-Soviet society, Kyrgyzstan. One former prime minister said to me, "We must prove that democracy can deliver, as our governing experiment is a fragile one. People expect much from us, and they have little patience. If we fail, the crowds will be at our doorstep too." Competition and politics are real, and they mean something in Kyrgyzstan. Civil society has power. If we take the short view, yes, we can certainly see a focus on potential problems, challenges to freedoms or development. But if we look at the long view of it, since independence, we see a process of evolution. 25 years is not a long time in the life of a democracy, but Kyrgyzstan has packed more into that time than most of its contemporaries. So of course the question is it enough? I honestly don't know anyone in the government of Kyrgyzstan, politics, or civil society who is satisfied with the level of democracy in the country. Everyone wants change of one kind or another. You don't have to even ask them, they will tell you all about it. They'll tell you what's wrong. And I find that a very comforting notion. A true democracy must be fluid. It must evolve and adapt to reflect the needs of its constituents. Yes, democratic institutions must provide for a number of requisite problems and safeguards, and the implementation of those principles is often the subject of debate in the Kyrgyz Republic. These are very healthy signs. While 25 years is not a long time to establish self-sustaining democratic institutions, I believe that there is a robust debate among voices in the country that bodes promise for continued democratic progress in the next 25 years.
Very nice analysis and sharing your optimism for Kyrgyzstan. And I would like to give the floor to another of our colleagues here at TW, Professor Eric McGlinchey from George Mason University, who has been working on Kyrgyzstan and on the neighboring Uzbekistan and Tajikistan for a long time. Eric.
Thank you. Is the volume okay? All right, just want to make sure. First, I want to thank Ambassador Tokhtagulov for inviting me. I was pleasantly surprised to get the invitation. I have been among those that Eric just referenced who have frequently voiced a desire for more liberalization. I remember going to Kyrgyzstan in 2010 after the leadership change, which I actually don't call a revolution, and getting a somewhat cool reception by colleagues as a result of some of the comments I had made about the events of 2010. But I was received nonetheless, and I think that speaks well of Kyrgyzstan. This is a country that welcomes discourse, that welcomes criticism, and I was afraid that what I was going to have to say here today would be excessively critical, but in comparison to the ambassador's opening remarks, I'm actually reassured that I think I'm actually less critical of some of the things that you may have said. So again, thank you for the invitation. I'd also like to begin with an anecdote which, in my mind, illustrates the path that Kyrgyzstan is on. I will fully confess that my interest in Kyrgyzstan began not as an academic, but rather as someone who loves climbing. I was working in Russia, among other things, is horribly flat. And I looked at a map, and I ended up getting on a train, and 4 days later I was in Kyrgyzstan. A few years after that, I went to try to climb a mountain called Kyrgyzstan, which is a beautiful mountain in eastern Kyrgyzstan. It was hard to get there. It took a long time to get from the advanced base camp to the actual base camp. And the reason for that was we had contracted for a helicopter to take us in. We waited, and we waited, and we waited. Finally, the helicopter came, and I had the honor of riding next to the pilot on the way up McGlinchey Glacier to base camp. And he said, "Eric, you want to know why it took us so long for the helicopter to come?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Look over there." And in the moraine on the side of the glacier, there was another helicopter. And he said, "This was our other helicopter. We had two." I guess at the time they had two. And you had to wait. So this was the only one left. But we're going to get there nonetheless. We'll get you there nonetheless. And I think this is for me, captures the spirit of Kyrgyzstan. Things break. Things are patched together with duct tape sometimes. But I have no doubt that Kyrgyzstan's going to get there eventually. And we need to be patient. We will all get there. And I am enthusiastic to support Kyrgyzstan in this endeavor. I'd like to talk about 4 things in my brief comments here that I think, from academics' point of view, at least in my mind, helps make sense of where Kyrgyzstan is today. The 4 things are, first, leadership change, the nature of leadership change in the Kyrgyz Republic, and it's a bimodal nature. There's 2 ways that people exit power in Kyrgyzstan, and I think that's interesting because this doesn't exist anywhere else in Central Asia. The nature of social mobilization, the nature of foreign financial flows, and here I'll be picking up on a few of the insights that Alex shared in his comments, and perhaps taking a slightly different tack, but I think they're complementary. But again, like Alex, I feel this nature of connectivity, not necessarily the positive nature of connectivity that Fiona had articulated in the first panel, but this nature of connectivity has profound and not always good impacts for the Kyrgyz Republic. And then lastly, I'll touch on the Kyrgyz Republic's approach towards Islam, which, like the nature of leadership change in the country, is unique to the region. There's no other country that approaches Islam like the Kyrgyz Republic does. And I'm going to suggest that all these things are interconnected. So I'm going to try to tell a story, perhaps a causal story, about why we see the things that we do in the Kyrgyz Republic. Actually, I was wondering if anyone else was going to dive into the weeds and talk about Masaliev, and I see he's come up a couple times. I want to go back to Masaliev as well, because I think the story that I want to tell really begins with him. Masaliev, as Eric has laid out, did not make the transition from first secretary to president. Most of the other Central Asian first secretaries did make that transition. And I think this had a profound impact on the future of Central Asian politics. Most notably, I think what happened as a result of Masaliev's inability to make the transition, and then when I say inability, I don't want to overlook the agency here. Masaliev was okay with that. He didn't fight and hold on to power like so many other people did. So I give credit to Masaliev as well. But the fact that he did not make that transition to the first independent president of the Kyrgyz Republic led, I would argue, to a fragmentation of the political elite. We did not have this transition of a large then communist party to a large then post-communist presidential party, which we did in Kazakhstan, which we did in Uzbekistan. And this led to an erosion, I would argue, of autocratic capacity in the Kyrgyz Republic, much to, I think, the good fortune of the Kyrgyz Republic. And so if you look at the nature of how autocrats have come to office in the Kyrgyz Republic and how they've departed from office, it is completely different than the nature of, say, Uzbekistan, where we know that you come to office, well, there's only been one way of coming to office and one way of leaving, right? We know how that works. So Masaliev and Rosa Atunbayeva both voluntarily left office. to their credit. Akayev and Bakiev both involuntarily left, but nevertheless did leave. I would love to do a survey, this is just a sidebar here, in the Kyrgyz Republic and ask people what their views are of these four political figures. I have a suspicion that the people who voluntarily left office will probably occupy a higher status and perception than those who didn't, and that may be instructive to people who are currently in power. But the nature of leadership transition, I think, is consequential. The fragmentation that happened in 1990, 1991 is very consequential for what we're seeing here today. Related to that, the second point, social mobilization. I think the social mobilization that we see in the Kyrgyz Republic is unique both in the degree, that is, we don't see social mobilization anywhere else in Central Asia, to the extent that we see it in the Kyrgyz Republic. And also, and this may sound strange in light of the 1990 events, and in light of the 2010 events, and indeed in light of some of the bloodshed that surrounded 2005 and 2010, but I would nevertheless argue that it's unique in the degree of how peaceful it is. For the most part, social mobilization in Kyrgyzstan is relatively peaceful. Compare this to the social mobilization that we saw in Kyrgyzstan, and I think you get the point that I'm trying to get across. There's been no civil war. Yes, there's been momentary flashes of violence, but the more frequent kind of social mobilization we see is actually around things of civil society, things that are of interest to basic civil society. So, political issues. We see, of course, social mobilization around corruption, and many of the speakers have outlined that before. We also see social mobilization at the village level, at the oldest level. It's not always the central square in Bishkek. There's a lot of political social mobilization, and this, I think, is a defining attribute of Kyrgyz society. But we see social mobilization around economic issues. I feel incredibly sorry for the poor soul who has to announce that there's going to be a tax rate, or an increase in the rate of tariffs for water or gas or heat. I mean, people protest this, and I think to civil society's credit, there is a check on these kinds of things. Environmental issues. We see lots of protests around mining in the Kyrgyz Republic. Religion. I know the Kyrgyz government finds this a struggle, but I find it very heartening, the social mobilization that we've seen in Karasu around the Kamala family, both Imam Kamalov's death in 2006, and then Mohammed Rafiq Kamalov's incarceration, Rashad Kamalov's incarceration recently. The fact that civil society is willing to protest this, I think says something very profound about the nature of Kyrgyz society. And I think there's an iterative relationship between these first two things that I've outlined. Elite fragmentation, the limiting of autocratic capacity in Kyrgyzstan as a result of what happened in 1990, gave space for social mobilization. And at the same time, sustained social mobilization has now ensured that the concentration of power under the executive, as we've seen in other Central Asian states, is simply not going to happen. It's very difficult to do. So there's an iterative and I think self-sustaining, and I would almost say a virtuous cycle between the nature of executive authority and the nature of social mobilization that we see in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, which we don't see anywhere else in Central Asia. Okay, now let me bring up this issue about foreign financial flows. There's been two kinds of foreign financial flows that I see in the Kyrgyz Republic. One, there's been things like remittances, or what I would say U.S. financial assistance prior to 2001. These are dispersed financial flows which are very difficult for an executive to capture. These have largely been, I think, positive for the Kyrgyz Republic, for society, and indeed for state. And then there is the very concentrated financial flows that we've seen after 2001. Alex talked a little bit about this with the military support surrounding Manas. These were financial flows that were, for the most part, directly captured by the executive and people around the executive. I think we could go back earlier into the early 1990s. We saw a similar thing with gold in Akayev in the early 1990s, where there was a similar attempt to capture much of the wealth that was coming from gold mining, which Akai wisely at the time stepped back from. So the diverging nature of financial flows, I would argue, have had a profound impact on the politics of the country. When we see concentrated financial flows, as we saw in the early 1990s with gold, and most importantly, 2001-2010 with the base, this leads to political instability. And it leads to political instability because it undermines the one institution which I see as the glue of the system, which is Kyrgyz patronage politics. Patronage politics is dispersed in Kyrgyzstan. It's shared largely equally, one could say, among the political elite. But when you have situations where the executive can directly capture immense amount of wealth, as we saw in after 2001, this is when the system begins to break down. People begin to get upset. When Akai was capturing too much of this, and particularly when Bakiev and the Bakiev family was capturing too much of this, that's when we see elite political instability. And I think this has been crucial to the political change that we've seen in the past, for sure the past 15 years. Okay, last thing I'll talk about, I realize I'm running a little bit long here, is Islam. Kyrgyzstan is the most permissive of the countries towards Islam in Central Asia. Now there's some notable exceptions here. I would point to, again, the killing of Mohammad Rafiq Kamalov in 2006 and the incarceration of Rashad Kamalov in 2015. But we have to ask ourselves, why is there this space for Islam in Kyrgyzstan? And I think a part of it is because of the political space that was open with elite fragmentation, and part of it is the robust civil society that we have here. But I think it's worth stressing that we have seen a revival of Islam in the Kyrgyz Republic. We've seen a peaceful revival of Islam in the Kyrgyz Republic, and we've seen revival that has largely been tolerated by the state. And this, in my mind, is one of the greatest legacies of the past 25 years. It's something that directly sets the Kyrgyz Republic off from the neighboring countries, and it's something that I think the ambassador and everybody in the Kyrgyz Republic should take great pride in. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Marlene, also for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your analysis. I would like now to give the floor to our third speaker, Professor Sean Roberts, here teaching here at GW. Sean has been spending years and years in Kyrgyzstan, working both academically and as a practitioner, and he's also a patron of Kyrgyz art. So also multiple interests, multifaceted interest in the country and its culture.
Thank you very much. Of course, the problem with going last on a panel like this is that I'm going to repeat a lot of things. But hopefully I can frame my comments a little bit differently and pull together a lot of different ideas. What I want to talk about is Kyrgyzstan's model of development. That's partly because I teach international development, and I worked in Kyrgyzstan for USAID for a long period of time. But I also think that you could make a case that Kyrgyzstan does have a unique approach to development. And I'm going to say something obvious to open up that discussion, which is that one of the things we've seen since 1991 is the 5 countries of Central Asia have become very, very different. They share a common history, they have a lot of cultural commonalities, but for a couple different reasons, they've developed very differently. One of those reasons is the natural kind of inheritance of resources. And that can't be denied, and that's an area where Kyrgyzstan, I think, is particularly challenged compared to, say, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, or Uzbekistan in particular. But it's also due to the policy choices that have been taken in the countries that sets them apart. In this context, I think Kyrgyzstan has charted perhaps the most innovative and bravest development path in the region. It's been messy, chaotic. As several people mentioned, it involved 2 revolutions or ousters of leaders. And it's been difficult given the sparse economic resources on the country's territory, its relatively small population, and its inevitable economic dependence on neighboring states, given its geographic location and being landlocked. However, I would argue it has ultimately been successful and has the potential to be even more so over the long term, and maybe even more sustainable than the models adopted by its neighbors. Arguably, Kyrgyzstan has been the only country in the region to adopt a mostly liberal approach to development, both economically and politically. This has meant being more collaborative than other Central Asian states with international development organizations, particularly in the realm of policy. However, unlike other former Soviet states which have sought to adopt similar paths, such as Ukraine and Georgia, the Kyrgyz Republic has succeeded in leveraging international assistance to implement liberal reforms without antagonizing Moscow by suggesting that it's aligned with the United States and Europe rather than Russia. I think that's an important point, and it's been very important to Kyrgyzstan's ability to undertake these reforms. In essence, Kyrgyzstan has successfully delinked its approach to economic and particularly political development from its foreign policy allegiances. And this pragmatic approach to liberalizing has further allowed the Kyrgyz Republic to frequently assert its independence internationally, despite its relatively weak economic and political power globally. Recent examples include forcing the closure of the NATO-led Manas air base, its clear recognition of the legitimacy of the Ukrainian people's ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, and its refusal to agree to Turkey's request to close schools sponsored by Fethullah Gulen. I think it's especially important to recognize the Kyrgyzstan Republic's consistent embrace of liberalism throughout its 25-year history, and I think that's why a case can be made for a model of development. While the country has experienced 2 regime changes, both calling for increased democratization, its engagement with liberal reforms was not an outcome of these changes in government. Rather, liberalization has been a constant aspect of Kyrgyzstan's reform agenda from the very beginning of the country's independence. Furthermore, these reforms have consistently engaged international development organizations in ways that other states in the region have not. Its first president, Askar Akayev, who's come up several times today, while he was later disgraced by the corruption of his family members and his later attempts to control the country's political arena, he did forge a liberal path towards development during the first days of the country's independence. And I think this is something that both Erics have brought up in different ways. He pushed through reforms, for example, that allowed Kyrgyzstan to become the first former Soviet state to join the WTO, even prior to the Baltic states, which is really an incredible accomplishment. And likewise, although Akayev was eventually able to manipulate the country's political system and maintain his presidency for almost 15 years, throughout his tenure, opposition political parties were active in parliament, and the country had a freer media and civil society than anywhere else in the region. And although you didn't see a lot of OSCE reports declaring free and fair elections, anybody who was present at elections in the region in the 1990s and throughout the early 2000s can attest that really the only competitive elections, although not flawed, were in Kyrgyzstan. So there's much different expectations of how politics worked in this country than anywhere else in the region. And it should be noted that Kyrgyzstan is the only country in Central Asia that has ever had an election branded as free and fair by the OSCE. Famously, the policies that enabled this liberalization during the 1990s led to the Kyrgyz Republic becoming the darling of the international development community in Central Asia, and as has already been mentioned, being declared the Switzerland of the region. Although these expectations eventually also resulted in frustration from Western states with the pace of political reform in the country. In hindsight, I believe this frustration demonstrated more the hubris of the international community than the actual issues on the ground in Kyrgyzstan. As Rudenshiold mentioned, 25 years is a very short time when we think about development, and have expectations that the country would adopt a liberal democracy that's functional immediately, I think is misplaced in general. But most importantly, the largely liberal experience of the Akayev regime set a tone in the country where the politically active population would not be content with stagnating reforms. Arguably, it was this precedent that led to the downfall of Akayev himself, as popular protest movements led by the political opposition and civil society members toppled the country's first president in March 2005. Now, however, the regime that replaced Akayev proved to be a major disappointment for most people in Kyrgyzstan. Akayev's successor, Kurmanbek Bakiyev, was far more corrupt and authoritarian than his predecessor. Still, even given Bakiyev's authoritarian tendencies, the environment in the country forced him to continue to at least formally embrace liberalizing reforms. Furthermore, he found himself under constant pressure from activists who opposed his more repressive rule, and ultimately the situation again resulted in regime change in April 2010 that would fundamentally alter the political system of the country. Now, while the second ouster of the leader was arguably less popularly led than the first, the political opposition that propelled it took more decisive steps to ensure that a repeated return to authoritarianism would not occur in the Kyrgyz Republic. And as already been mentioned, some by Rudenshiold, the country installed an interim president as political leaders worked on a new constitution that would establish unprecedented checks and balances in the political system. And I've long been a real admirer of this constitution, in part because it doesn't follow a template from other countries. And it really tries to work out problems that the political elite perceive as being specific to Kyrgyzstan. So, as already been mentioned, it created a more empowered parliament, a dual executive, a popularly elected one-term president, and a prime minister chosen by the parliament, and even a stipulation that prevented any one party from winning a complete majority of parliamentary seats. And this is something that hasn't come into effect because I don't think any party in Kyrgyzstan has gotten more than 15 or 18%. But it was very clearly established to prevent a renewed state capture by one political force and particularly one political personality. And also, lots of other nuanced reforms were added to the system, including a unique system of diagonal accountability where citizen-led committees are given oversight over ministries and state agencies. The central bank has established much stronger transparency and put a lot of its budgetary revenues and expenditures online. So I think you see here a really unique system that has developed since 2010. However, it's not a system without its problems. The country still suffers substantially from corruption across sectors, but especially, I think, in law enforcement and the justice sectors. Political parties have yet to establish concrete platforms that distinguish themselves from one another and are largely based on the personalities of specific politicians. And politics in general have been dominated by populist themes, including Kyrgyz ethnic nationalism. Of course, that last point, I think, in the United States, we can't really criticize in other countries, given our present presidential election. However, these are also all problems that are common to developing countries attempting to adopt democratic reforms, especially among those in lower income categories. And to return to what Rudenshiold said, 25 years is not a long time. What I think is remarkable about the first 25 years of an independent Kyrgyz Republic is that the country has adopted an unlikely development path, especially given its position geographically. I also believe that it has been a wise path given the country's sparse natural resources and geographical position surrounded by much more powerful states, both militarily and economically. And over the long term, the particular pragmatic liberalism of Kyrgyzstan's development model may even prove to make it the most resilient country in the region, as most of the other states' dependence on natural resources begins to negatively affect their sustainability. The main question that faces the country now is whether it can continue along this path into the future. In 2017, the country will face its second fully competitive presidential election under its new model of governance. And the successful implementation of that election will be a critical sign of the system's sustainability. Furthermore, it appears likely, according to a lot of analysts, that the US and European involvement in Central Asia in general is on the wane. And that, of course, firmly entrenches Russia and China as the major political and economic influences in Central Asia. This development could present potential autocrats with an opportunity for a new state capture that would involve few international consequences. Despite these challenges, I remain optimistic about the future of liberalism in the Kyrgyz Republic, primarily because it is instilled in the population itself and has not been merely the project of ambitious politicians. And I think this gets to Eric McGlinchey's point about the social mobilization, the characteristics of that in Kyrgyzstan. One might expect that attempts to consolidate a more authoritarian system in the country would meet the same fate as it did in 2005 and 2010 for this exact reason. Regardless, I hope that we might be able to have a similar panel on the occasion of the country's 50th anniversary that lauds the Kyrgyz Republic as a model of development and resilience that is to be adopted by other countries.